Smoke, thick and acrid, still rose to the leaden sky over what, just yesterday, was Sarai Burqa, the capital of the world, the heart of the great Golden Horde. He stood on a high mound, a man whose name thundered from the Dnieper to the Irtysh, and looked upon the work of his hands. He did not hold the torch, but it was he who had summoned the fire. Tokhtamysh, the last great Khan of the Ulus of Yochi, gazed upon the apocalypse that bore his name. His weathered face, once full of a Khan's pride, was now a mask carved from the stone of grief and disbelief. Below him lay not just the ruins of a city. There in the ash and embers, his dreams, his empire, his legacy were burning out. Only a few years ago, in the year 1395 from the birth of Christ, he was a ruler without equal in the steppes since the time of Batu Khan. He had united a fractured state. He had forced a defiant Moscow to pay tribute once more. He had restored the horde to its former glory. He was a creator, a restorer, almost a demiurge, and now he was a spectator to his own collapse, a living monument to how the brightest ascent can turn into the most devastating fall. The roar of the battle on the Terek still echoed in his ears, the screams of his warriors being swallowed by the iron divisions of the Iron Lame. Tamerlane, his former patron, his teacher, his curse. How? How did he, who had brought the horde back to life, become its gravedigger? How did his greatest ambition, to make the horde great again, turn into its complete annihilation? This question, silent and furious, beat inside his skull while the fire below devoured Sarai. This story is not about the battle of two empires. It is the story of how the greatest ambition becomes the greatest curse, and how one man, striving to become the sun, turned his world into a scorched desert. To understand the depth of this fall, we must return to the very beginning, to the boiling cauldron of the second half of the 14th century, to the world that gave birth to both Tokhtamysh and his relentless enemy. To fully grasp the scale of Tokhtamysh's tragedy, one must immerse oneself in the world that shaped him. The world of the Great Troubles, as Russian chroniclers aptly and grimly named it. The second half of the 14th century was a time of agony and bloody chaos for the Golden Horde. The once monolithic empire, stretching from the Danube to Siberia, had become a patchwork quilt stitched with threads of betrayal and intrigue. On the throne in Sarai, puppet khans replaced one another with kaleidoscopic speed, ephemeral rulers whose lives were often measured in months, if not weeks. Real power belonged not to them, not to the legitimate descendants of Genghis Khan, but to those who could gather a larger army and shed more blood. The chief puppeteer was the warlord Mamai, a figure of colossal energy and ambition, but with one fatal flaw. Not a single drop of the sacred blood of the Golden Kin flowed in his veins. He was a regent, a general, the de facto ruler, but he could never become a legitimate Khan. This illegitimacy eroded his power from within, forcing him to constantly wage war, to prove his right by force. Meanwhile, the horde itself was fracturing. In the east, in the White Horde, ruled their own, more legitimate Khans, who looked with contempt on the farce in Sarai. In the west, the empire's fringes had effectively broken away. The Russian principalities, though still paying tribute, were raising their heads ever more boldly, which culminated in Mamai's crushing defeat at the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380. This world was a chessboard drenched in blood, where each piece acted only in its own interest. The old laws of Genghis Khan's Yasa were forgotten. The only law was force. It was an era that desperately needed a hero, a leader who could gather the fragments of former greatness. but this same era was ready to devour and destroy anyone who dared to challenge it. It was in this world, where the right to life and power had to be won anew each day with a sword, that the young prince Tokhtamysh appeared. A man in whose veins flowed the right blood, and in whose heart burned a fire capable of either illuminating the steppe or burning it to the ground. In this boiling cauldron of intrigue and strife, origin was everything. It was a banner that thousands could follow, and at the same time, a target that attracted assassins' daggers. Tokhtamysh possessed the one thing his main rival, Mamai, lacked. He was a Chinggisid, a direct descendant of Jochi, the eldest and beloved son of the conqueror of the universe. This blood was his indisputable right, his sacred mandate to rule. In the eyes of the steppe aristocracy, and even the common people, only a Chinggisid could be a legitimate Khan, only he could restore order and justice. However, this same blood became his curse from the moment he was born. His father was an influential ruler and a rightful claimant to the throne of the White Horde. But another, more powerful Chinggisid stood in his way. Genghis Khan, a cruel and powerful ruler who tolerated no rivals. On Genghis Khan's order, Tokhtamysh's father was executed. In an instant, the young prince was transformed from an heir to the throne into an exile, a fugitive with a price on his head. The shadow of his murdered father fell upon his entire future, becoming the source of his unquenchable thirst for revenge and, simultaneously, his desperate drive to prove his right to what had been taken from his family. From a young age, he knew not the luxury of the Khan's court, but the cold of steppe nights, hunger, and constant fear. He was forced to hide, relying on the mercy of distant relatives and the loyalty of the few warriors who remained faithful to his executed father. This ancestral curse, this trauma of exile shaped his character. He learned to be distrustful, to be cruel when necessary, and to be immensely persistent in achieving his goals. Unlike the short-lived Khans raised on Sarai's intrigues, Tokhtamysh was hardened in the fire of real hardship. He carried within him not just a desire for power, but a deep existential need to restore justice, to reclaim what was rightfully his, and to avenge the blood that had been shed. It was this explosive mixture of legitimate rights and personal vendetta that made him such a dangerous and unpredictable player on the stage of the Great Troubles. Destiny, like a great river, sometimes takes the most unexpected turns, bringing together people whose meeting can change the course of history. For the young exile Tokhtamysh, such a turning point was his flight south, beyond the hostile lands of the Kipchak steppe, into the realm where a new, dazzling, and terrifying star was rising. He sought refuge in Samarkand, in the capital of Emir Timur, whom the world would soon know as Tamerlane, the Iron Lame. This meeting, which took place around the year 1376, was not just an act of political pragmatism. It felt like something predestined, a collision of two tectonic plates. On one side, a young Chinggisid, full of rage and legitimate claims, possessing legitimacy but lacking power. On the other, a mature warlord, already covered in scars and glory, who had not a drop of Genghis Khan's blood, but possessed an invincible army and a brilliant mind. Tamerlane, himself a master of the great game, instantly saw in Tokhtamysh not just a supplicant, but a perfect tool. By supporting a legitimate Chinggisid and placing him on the throne of the Golden Horde, Tamerlane could turn his northern neighbor from a perennial threat into a vassal, a friendly state, securing his borders and gaining a powerful ally. For Tokhtamysh, Tamerlane was his only hope, his last chance for revenge. He saw in the Iron Lame not just a patron, but a father figure, a mentor whose military genius and political acumen inspired awe. Their alliance was a match made in geopolitical heaven. Tamerlane showered Tokhtamysh with favors. He gave him troops, money, and cities to rule. He seemed to be molding him into a future Khan, investing resources and hopes in him. But even then, a crack was embedded in this alliance. Tamerlane saw Tokhtamysh as his appointee, a grateful client. Tokhtamysh, while accepting the gifts, deep down never considered himself anyone's vassal. He was a descendant of Genghis Khan, and for him, this alliance was merely a temporary means to a great end. This meeting in Samarkand became the prologue to one of the most grandiose and tragic dramas in Asian history. A drama of friendship and betrayal, of student and teacher, of two titans who first helped each other reach the summit, and then tried to push each other into the abyss. The years Tokhtamysh spent at Tamerlane's court in Samarkand were not merely a period of exile, but a harsh yet invaluable academy of power. It was the forge of his character, where the steel of a future ruler was hammered from the hot metal of youthful ambitions and grievances. Every day was a lesson. He watched how the Iron Lame governed his diverse empire, how he administered justice, how he planned military campaigns with mathematical precision. He saw how Tamerlane rewarded the loyal and mercilessly punished traitors. It was a clear demonstration of how real, not nominal, power worked, based not only on the right of blood, but on iron will, cunning, and intimidation. But these lessons came at a high price. Tokhtamysh's position was ambiguous and humiliating. He was a royal guest, but also a hostage, a supplicant completely dependent on the will of his patron. He had to bow to Tamerlane's emirs, men of common birth whose power was greater than his own. Every piece of bread, every warrior given to him was an act of mercy he was never allowed to forget. This constant humiliation burned him from within, but it also tempered him. He learned to hide his true feelings behind a mask of respectful gratitude. He mastered the art of flattery and patience. He understood that anger was a luxury an exile could not afford. But while his lips spoke words of thanks, his heart filled not only with gratitude, but also with a secret, carefully concealed envy and a desire to one day become his benefactor's equal, and perhaps even surpass him. Tamerlane, a keen psychologist himself, likely saw this duality. Perhaps it even suited him. A grateful debtor is a reliable vassal, but he underestimated the depth of pride inherent in the descendants of Genghis Khan. The years in Samarkand transformed Tokhtamysh from an impulsive youth into a calculating and dangerous politician. They taught him to wait, but they also kindled in him such an all-consuming fire of ambition that once he gained power, he could no longer stop until that fire had consumed both his enemies and himself. The path to the throne is never strewn with roses, and for Tokhtamysh, it was paved with a series of humiliating defeats before being crowned with his first significant victory. Armed with an army and resources provided by Tamerlane, he set out on his first campaign to the east, to the lands of the White Horde, to challenge the sons of his sworn enemy, Genghis Khan. His first taste of blood, his first serious test as a commander, ended in total failure. In a battle against Timur Malik, the son of Genghis Khan, Tokhtamysh's army was utterly defeated, and he himself, wounded, barely escaped with his life, appearing before Tamerlane once again like a beaten dog. The Iron Lame did not turn his back on him. Perhaps he saw this defeat as a useful lesson for his overly impatient protégé. He gave him a new, even larger army. And again, Tokhtamysh invaded the steppes, and again he was defeated. This second failure was even more devastating. It seemed as though fate had turned against him, that he was destined to remain an eternal failure, dependent on the mercy of the Samarkand emir. Anyone else in his place might have broken, given up their claims. But it was here, at the depths of despair, that Tokhtamysh's defining character trait emerged, the very one that would later both elevate and destroy him: his phenomenal, almost irrational persistence. He did not give up. He returned to Tamerlane again, and, as the chronicles attest, the Iron Lame was so impressed by his unyielding will that he decided to give him a third, final chance. This time, fortune smiled upon him. His enemy, Timur Malik, had managed to alienate his own nobility with his cruelty and debauchery. When Tokhtamysh appeared for the third time, many emirs of the White Horde defected to his side. In the decisive battle, he finally achieved victory, killing his opponent. This first real victory meant everything to him. It washed away the shame of past defeats, established him as a serious warrior and leader, and most importantly, gave him a foothold: the throne of the White Horde. It was in these campaigns, in this series of failures and final triumph, that he first displayed his key qualities: tactical flexibility, the ability to learn from mistakes, and above all, an inhuman stubbornness that refused to accept defeat. Behind every great deed, behind every conquest and political maneuver, there is always something more than just a lust for power or wealth. Tokhtamysh had his own inner demon, his own secret, all-consuming motivation that was far deeper and more complex than simply wanting to reclaim the throne that rightfully belonged to his father. He did not want to be just another Khan in the endless line of Golden Horde rulers. His goal was grandiose, almost messianic. He saw himself not merely as an avenger, but as a restorer, a man destined by fate to end the great troubles, to put an end to decades of chaos and fratricidal slaughter, and to resurrect the Ulis of Yochi in its original, invincible glory. In his dreams, the Horde was to become once again as it had been under its greatest rulers, Batu, the founder, and Burqa, the first Muslim Khan. He wanted to bring back the times when the mere name of the Horde inspired awe from Krakow to Baghdad, when Russian princes meekly brought tribute to Sarai, and caravans traveled unhindered along the Great Silk Road under the protection of the Khan's governors. This dream was his guiding star and his curse. It gave him the strength to endure humiliation, to rise after defeats, and to lead men. But it also bred in him a dangerous impatience and pride. He believed that any cruelty was justified if it served the great goal of restoring the empire. He believed that his divine right as a Chinggisid placed him above ordinary men and even above his benefactor Tamerlane, who, for all his power, was merely an emir from a common clan. This inner fire, this drive not just to restore, but to surpass the glory of his ancestors, became the engine that first carried him to the pinnacle of power, and then, when he thought he had already reached his goal, blinded him. He forgot the lessons of humility learned in exile and began to believe in his own infallibility. It is this deep-seated motivation, this obsession with the idea of greatness, that explains why, after uniting the Horde, he did not stop, but went further, challenging the entire world and, ultimately, his creator, thereby setting in motion the mechanism of self-destruction. Having finally found firm ground beneath his feet and established himself on the throne of the White Horde, Tokhtamysh did not delay. He became an unstoppable steppe whirlwind, rapidly gathering the scattered pieces of the once great empire. His first and primary target was the West, the Blue Horde, where the power of the usurper Mamai hung by a thread after the crushing defeat at Kulikovo. Tokhtamysh acted decisively and with lightning speed. He led his forces to the Volga, and the very fact that a legitimate Genghis was at the head of the army became his greatest weapon. The steppe aristocracy, tired of the rule of an illegitimate warlord, defected to his side in droves. Mamai, abandoned by most of his emirs, was defeated in a battle on the Kalka River in 1380, the very same place where Tokhtamysh's ancestors had won their first great victory over the Rus's Cuman forces. The defeated usurper fled to Crimea, to the Genoese colony of Kaffa, where he was treacherously murdered. With Mamai's death, the last barrier to unification fell. Tokhtamysh entered Sarai not just as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler, a liberator. For the first time in over 2 decades of the bloody Great Troubles, the White and Blue Hordes, the 2 wings of the Ulus of Yochi, were once again under the rule of a single Khan. This was his triumph, the moment he had been striving for his entire life through blood, humiliation, and defeat. He immediately began to strengthen central authority, minting coins with his name, restoring order, and sending messengers to all corners of the former empire with a formidable demand to recognize his power. He ended the internal strife, united vast military forces under his banner, and backed by his powerful patron Tamerlane, made the world reckon with the Golden Horde once again. At that moment, it seemed his grand dream of restoring the empire was coming true. He truly looked like a savior, the very leader the strife-torn steppe had been waiting for so long. With the unification of the Horde under Tokhtamysh's iron hand, the geopolitical landscape of Eastern Europe and Central Asia changed dramatically. The sleeping giant had awakened, and its heavy breath was felt by all its neighbors. Whereas the fragmented and weakened horde had previously been more of a regional problem, it now transformed back into a superpower that everyone had to reckon with. From the Grand Duchy of Lithuania in the west to Tamerlane's empire in the south. The Russian principalities were the first to feel this change. The victory at Kulikovo had created an illusion that the Mongol yoke was nearly over. They saw Mamai's death as a good omen, and initially did not perceive a great threat in the rise of Tokhtamysh, a protege of the distant Tamerlane. This was a fatal mistake. Tokhtamysh, obsessed with the idea of restoring the empire to its old borders, could not tolerate Moscow's insubordination. The payment of tribute was not just an economic issue, it was a symbol of submission, the cornerstone of the horde's power, and the new Khan was determined to restore this order at any cost. He sent ambassadors to the Muscovite prince Dmitry Donskoy, demanding the resumption of full tribute payments. After receiving an evasive answer, Tokhtamysh understood that words were powerless. Power that is not backed by force is not power at all. He behaved similarly on other fronts. In the Caucasus, his troops raided defiant tribes, demonstrating who was now master of the region. He also turned his gaze to the wealthy Khwarezm, which Tamerlane considered his own domain, a first, almost imperceptible harbinger of the coming storm. Under his rule, the Golden Horde once again became a single organism, predatory and aggressive. The trade routes, which had fallen into decay during the years of turmoil, began to revive under the protection of his governors. Sarai once again became a center of attraction for merchants and diplomats. Tokhtamysh, the legitimate Chingisid, had restored not only unity, but also international prestige to the horde. He felt on top of the world, a true heir to Batu, and was preparing to teach the cruelest of lessons to all who doubted it. And first on that list was Moscow. The campaign against Moscow in 1382 became the hallmark of Tokhtamysh's reign, an action that fully revealed both his military genius and his strategic short-sightedness, mixed with incredible cruelty. From a military standpoint, it was a flawless operation, a tactical masterpiece. Understanding that after the Battle of Kulikovo, the Russian forces were ready for an open engagement, Tokhtamysh gambled on surprise and cunning. He gathered a huge army but spread a rumor that he was marching on the Volga Bulgars. He forbade Russian merchants in the horde from leaving its borders so that no one could warn Moscow. His army moved north, not along the traditional steppe roads, but via circuitous routes, with a speed incredible for such a large force. As a result, his appearance before the walls of Moscow was a complete surprise to the Russians. Prince Dmitry Donskoy, unable to assemble his troops in time, was forced to flee north to Kostroma. Moscow was left defenseless. Here, Tokhtamysh displayed another facet of his talent, the art of deception. After 2 days of unsuccessfully storming the well-fortified white stone Kremlin, he resorted to a trick. Through the Nizhny Novgorod princes in his army, he swore to the Muscovites that he would not harm them if they voluntarily opened the gates and paid tribute. The exhausted and deceived citizens believed him and opened the gates. In that same instant, the horde's warriors burst into the city and carried out a monstrous massacre, plundering and burning Moscow to the ground. From a tactical perspective, the goal was brilliantly achieved. All the Russian princes, including the one from Tver, were terrified. They immediately sent envoys to the horde, acknowledged Tokhtamysh's authority, and resumed paying tribute in full. The power of the horde was restored. However, strategically, this triumph was a colossal mistake. If the Battle of Kulikovo was a symbol of possible liberation, the burning of Moscow became an unhealing wound for the Russian people, a symbol of the horde's treachery and inhuman cruelty. It destroyed any possibility of loyalty, leaving behind only fear and a burning hatred that would accumulate for decades. Tokhtamysh got his tribute, but he forever lost the chance for a stable and peaceful submission of Rus, turning it into a mortal enemy that was simply biding its time. The central nerve of Tokhtamysh's entire epic, the axis around which his fate revolved, was his relationship with Tamerlane. This was not just a story of alliance and enmity between two rulers. It was a deep personal drama, Shakespearean in its intensity, a story of a father and son, a teacher and student, a benefactor and an ungrateful protégé. At the beginning of their journey, Tamerlane, or Emir Timur as he was called, was everything to Tokhtamysh, a savior, a patron, a source of strength and power. Without the support of the Iron Lame, the young exile could never have even dreamed of the throne. Tamerlane, in turn, saw Tokhtamysh as his most successful geopolitical project. He invested enormous resources in him, and Tokhtamysh justified this investment by uniting the horde and creating what Tamerlane thought was a friendly buffer state on his empire's northern borders. He called Tokhtamysh his son, and perhaps, to some extent, truly felt paternal affection for him. But as Tokhtamysh's power grew, the dynamic of their relationship changed. Having restored the horde's unity and subjugated Rus, Tokhtamysh no longer felt indebted. He was a Chinggisid, a descendant of the masters of the world, while Tamerlane, for all his greatness, was merely an emir from the Turkic Barlas clan. In Tokhtamysh's eyes, the student had not just caught up to, but had surpassed the teacher in nobility and the legitimacy of his power. He began to see Tamerlane not as a patron, but as a rival, another predator sharing the world with him. Tamerlane, for his part, watched his son's independence with growing irritation. He expected gratitude and vassal-like obedience, but received audacious demands and aggressive actions on his borders instead. Two titanic egos, two indomitable wills, clashed on the same chessboard. Their personal relationship, woven from a complex mix of gratitude, envy, paternal pride, and filial rebellion, became the catalyst for a global conflict. Every step Tokhtamysh took to assert his independence, Tamerlane perceived as a personal insult and black ingratitude. And every attempt by Tamerlane to put him in his place, Tokhtamysh considered a humiliating encroachment on his Khan's dignity. This psychological conflict was no less important than their territorial disputes, and it was what ultimately turned the two former allies into sworn enemies, ready to stake their empires to destroy one another. Every great tragedy has its turning point, its Rubicon, after which there is no way back. For Tokhtamysh, that moment was his decision to invade the Caucasus, the lands of Azerbaijan and Shirvan, which Tamerlane already firmly considered his zone of interest. This happened around the year 1385. By this time, Tokhtamysh was at the peak of his power. He was the sole ruler of the unified Golden Horde, the conqueror of Moscow. His name inspired fear, and it was at this moment that he was overcome by that very hubris the ancient Greeks spoke of, the overconfidence that makes a mortal challenge the gods or fate. He decided he no longer needed the tutelage of his father, Tamerlane. Moreover, he decided that he had a historical right to the lands of Transcaucasia, which had once been part of the Ulus of Yochi. With a huge army, he invaded Azerbaijan, took and plundered its capital, Tabriz, seizing colossal spoils. From a military standpoint, it was another success, but politically, it was suicide. This was not just a border violation. It was a slap in the face, a public humiliation dealt to Tamerlane. Tokhtamysh did not just capture another city. He demonstratively showed the whole world that he no longer considered himself a vassal or even a junior partner of the Iron Lame. He declared himself an equal, if not superior, force. At that moment, he crossed an invisible line. Before this, their disagreements could be considered border disputes, family quarrels. But after Tabriz, it became a matter of honor. For Tamerlane, whose power rested not only on the strength of his army, but also on his reputation as an invincible and formidable ruler, to forgive such an act was impossible. It would mean showing weakness, which would immediately cause unrest throughout his vast empire. Tokhtamysh's Caucasus campaign was the stone that started an avalanche. It turned a cold war into a hot one, personal dislike into a mortal feud. By making this decision, blinded by his successes and the pride of a Genghis Khan, Tokhtamysh signed the death warrant for both himself and his reborn empire with his own hands. Having reached the zenith of his power, Tokhtamysh committed an act that definitively closed any possibility for peace and turned the conflict with Tamerlane into a personal vendetta. Intoxicated by his victories, controlling a vast territory from Siberia to Crimea, he decided the time had come to speak to his former patron not as a supplicant, but as a sovereign. He sent ambassadors to Tamerlane with an ultimatum. The text of this message, as relayed by Eastern chroniclers, breathes with incredible pride and self-assurance. Tokhtamysh did not ask, he demanded. He declared his legitimate rights to Khwarezm and the entire Caucasus, addressing Tamerlane as an equal, if not as an inferior. According to legend, he wrote, "You are an emir, and I am a Khan, a descendant of Genghis Khan. It is for you to stand before my throne, not to sit on a par with me." This was not just a diplomatic démarche. It was an act of pure madness, a moment of absolute hubris. Tokhtamysh forgot everything. He forgot how he had crawled to Samarkand as a destitute exile. He forgot that it was Tamerlane who had given him an army and power. He forgot that the Iron Lame's war machine had never known defeat. In his mind, reality had become distorted. He, the great Khan, the restorer of the Horde, a descendant of the Golden Kin, truly believed that he stood above a mere emir, even if that emir was the most powerful in the world. This ultimatum was the last straw for Tamerlane. He perceived it not as a political demand, but as the deepest personal insult, a betrayal by the man he considered his son. The rage of the Iron Lame, as sources report, was terrible. He realized he was dealing not with a straying vassal, but with an existential threat, a rabid dog he himself had raised. From that moment, war became inevitable. But it was not to be a mere war for territory. It was to be a punitive expedition, a war of annihilation, aimed not just at defeating Tokhtamysh, but at wiping him from the face of the earth and making a public example of his black ingratitude. Tokhtamysh's moment of hubris, his verbal challenge thrown at Tamerlane, became the trigger that set in motion the most terrifying war machine of that era. Tamerlane's response was not impulsive. The Iron Lame never acted in anger. His fury was always cold and calculated. He did not immediately rush deep into the steppes. Instead, he began to methodically and relentlessly tighten the ring around Tokhtamysh's domains, demonstrating who was truly the master of the situation. The first cracks in the monolith of Tokhtamysh's power appeared precisely on the southern frontiers. Tamerlane's armies, one after another, began to reconquer the disputed territories. First, Khwarezm fell, cruelly punished for its temporary loyalty to Tokhtamysh. Then, the Iron Lame's divisions drove the Horde's garrisons from the Caucasus. Each such military operation was a painful flick on the nose for Tokhtamysh. He tried to respond, sending his own detachments, but they were generally defeated by Tamerlane's more disciplined and experienced veterans. These initial defeats were not yet a catastrophe, but they were ominous harbingers of the coming storm. They showed that Tokhtamysh's army, a formidable force against Russian principalities or internal enemies, was clearly inferior to the iron legions of the Samarkand ruler. More importantly, these failures began to undermine Tokhtamysh's authority within the horde itself. The steppe aristocracy always follows a winner. As long as Tokhtamysh was winning, his power was absolute. But as soon as he began to lose, a dull rumbling of discontent started in his circle. The emirs he had forced into submission began to question. Was their Khan so wise, if he had dragged the horde into a foreseeably losing war with the most powerful ruler in the world? These first cracks were still small, but they fractured the integrity of his empire. Tokhtamysh, instead of realizing the danger and trying to find a diplomatic solution, perceived these setbacks as annoying obstacles that only fueled his stubbornness. He still believed he could turn the tide, that in a decisive battle his steppe cavalry would overcome the enemy. He did not see or did not want to see that his opponent was not just reconquering cities. He was slowly and surely preparing the ground for a mortal blow. Instead of drawing conclusions from his initial defeats and strengthening his defenses, Tokhtamysh, driven by stubbornness and desperation, committed the most fateful act of his life. In the year 1388, taking advantage of Tamerlane being occupied with another military campaign in Persia, he decided to strike a blow that he believed would be decisive. He gathered a huge army and invaded not just the borderlands of Tamerlane's empire, but its very heart, Transoxiana, the flourishing oasis between the Amu Darya and Sir Darya rivers. Tokhtamysh's forces swept through the region with fire and sword, plundered the outskirts of Samarkand, and laid siege to the holy city of Bukhara. This act was the pinnacle of his strategic madness. He hoped this audacious raid would force Tamerlane to abandon his conquests and sue for peace on his terms. In reality, he achieved the exact opposite. For Tamerlane, this was no longer a political confrontation or a matter of honor. It was sacrilege. The enemy had invaded his home, ravaged the lands that were the cradle of his power, and threatened his capital. It was a personal, profound insult that the Iron Lame could not forgive and would not forget. News of the invasion reached him in Persia. As the chronicles attest, he immediately ceased his campaign, leaving other conquests unfinished. From that moment, he had only one goal, one thought, one passion: to find and destroy Tokhtamysh. The invasion of Transoxiana was the final straw that turned the cup of his wrath into a raging ocean. He understood that he was dealing with an enemy who would stop at nothing, and that the only way to ensure peace for his empire was the complete and unconditional destruction, not just of Tokhtamysh's army, but of the entire Golden Horde as a political and economic force. This fatal campaign, intended as a show of strength, in fact set in motion an inexorable machine of retribution. Tokhtamysh had awakened the beast, and now that beast was coming for him, and the entire great steppe was too small a place to hide. The news of Tokhtamysh's invasion of Transoxiana forced Tamerlane to act with the total, all-consuming resolve that made him the conqueror of the universe. He set aside all his plans in Iran and India. The entire colossal might of his empire was now directed toward a single goal: preparing for the great campaign to the north, into the heart of the Kipchak steppe, to put an end to his ungrateful son once and for all. Preparations began on an unprecedented scale. Messengers flew to every corner of his domains, from Baghdad to Kashgar, with mobilization orders. The best troops flocked to Samarkand. Heavy cavalry from Persia, tireless Turkic archers from Central Asia, infantry from conquered cities, engineers capable of building bridges and siege engines. According to Timur's court historians, an army of about 200,000 men was assembled, a colossal figure for that era. It was not just an army, it was an entire world on the march. The preparation was conducted with Tamerlane's trademark methodicalness. Huge reserves of food and fodder were created. Scouts were sent far into the steppe to study routes, find water sources, and locate pastures. A communication system was established, allowing the emir to control this vast mass of people. The very atmosphere in Samarkand was permeated with the premonition of a great, decisive battle. This was not just another campaign of conquest, it was a crusade of vengeance. Tamerlane personally oversaw all preparations. His iron will was felt everywhere. He understood that he was marching not just against an enemy army, but into an alien world, into the vast, treacherous steppe, where the main enemy could be not men, but space, hunger, and cold. Tokhtamysh, in his own lands, also knew of the impending invasion, but he probably did not fully realize its scale. He still hoped that, like his ancestors, he could lure the enemy deep into the steppes, exhaust him, and defeat him piecemeal. He did not understand that he was facing no ordinary opponent, but fate itself in the person of the Iron Lame, and that fate had already passed its sentence. The inexorable advance of this gigantic war machine to the north was like the coming of a glacier, destined to freeze and destroy all life in its path. In the spring of 1391, the two greatest armies of their time clashed in the heart of the Eurasian steppe. Tamerlane, having marched thousands of kilometers through desolate lands, caught up with Tokhtamysh's army beyond the Volga, on the banks of the Kondurcha River. It was a clash of titans, a battle that would decide the fate not only of two rulers, but of their empires. Tokhtamysh, a natural son of the steppe, chose the classic tactic of his ancestors. He tried to avoid a pitched battle, wearing down Tamerlane's army with small skirmishes, attacking its rearguard and retreating, luring it ever deeper into the scorched plains. He hoped that hunger, thirst, and fatigue would do half the work for him. For a time, this tactic was successful. The Iron Lame's huge army suffered from a lack of water and provisions. But Tamerlane was not a commander to be defeated by attrition. His iron discipline and brilliant logistics allowed him to maintain his troops' combat readiness. Finally, on the 18th of June, he forced a decisive battle upon Tokhtamysh. The battle was incredibly fierce, and according to some sources, lasted for 3 days. The armies were of comparable size, and initially, the horde's warriors, fighting on their own land, even had the upper hand. Tokhtamysh personally led his troops in attack, his flanking maneuvers with horse archers creating serious problems for Tamerlane's army. But at the critical moment, the superiority of the Iron Lame in tactics and organization proved decisive. He held elite units in reserve, which he committed to the fight at the most critical moment, when Tokhtamysh's forces were already exhausted. The charge of these fresh troops broke the center of the horde's army. Panic ensued, quickly turning into a full-scale rout. Tokhtamysh's army, which had seemed invincible just moments before, ceased to exist. The Khan himself, abandoning his harem and treasury, barely managed to escape with a small detachment. Tamerlane's victory was total and unconditional. He seized immense booty and dealt his enemy a blow of terrible force. It seemed that Tokhtamysh was finished for good. The defeat at Kondurcha was a catastrophe. Tokhtamysh lost everything: his army, his treasury, his prestige. Anyone else in his place would have been broken and would have vanished from the historical stage forever. But it was at this moment, at the very nadir of his fall, that he once again displayed that incredible trait of his character that had once allowed him to ascend the throne, a phoenix-like ability to rise from the ashes. He fled north into the forest steppe zone, where he managed to hide from pursuit. Tamerlane, after plundering the horde's domains on the Volga, did not linger in the inhospitable steppes and turned back to Samarkand, confident that his enemy no longer posed a threat. And in this, he was mistaken. He had destroyed Tokhtamysh's army, but he had not destroyed Tokhtamysh himself, and as long as this indomitable Chinggisid lived, the idea of a unified horde lived too. Displaying miracles of energy and diplomacy, Tokhtamysh managed to achieve the almost impossible in just a few years. He once again traveled among the tribes loyal to him, persuading, threatening, promising. He reminded the emirs of their ancestors' glory and the shame of defeat at the hands of the lame emir, and the steppe, against all odds, followed him again. He was their legitimate Khan, the symbol of their independence, the only one who dared to defy Tamerlane. Gradually, piece by piece, he began to assemble a new army. He resumed minting coins to show that he was still the ruling sovereign. By 1394, just 3 years after his devastating rout, he once again controlled most of the Golden Horde and possessed an army strong enough to challenge his enemies anew. This revival was his greatest personal triumph, a demonstration of his unbending will. But it was also his fatal mistake. Reborn, he had failed to learn the main lesson from his defeat. He did not understand that open war with Tamerlane was suicide. Instead of lying low and gathering strength, blinded by a thirst for revenge, he once again began to raid Tamerlane's possessions in the Caucasus, as if taunting his mortal enemy. And Tamerlane, upon learning that his foe was back on his feet, realized he had made a mistake in leaving him alive. This time, he decided, there would be no half measures. Realizing that Tokhtamysh, like the mythical Hydra, could grow new heads to replace those cut off, the Khan began a frantic search for allies for the inevitable upcoming battle. He understood that he could not stand alone against the full might of Tamerlane's empire. His diplomatic activity during this period is staggering in its scope. He became a central figure in international politics, attempting to forge the first-ever broad anti-Timurid coalition. His ambassadors were sent in all known directions. He appealed to the Sultan of Egypt, who also saw Tamerlane as a mortal threat to his Syrian possessions. A lively correspondence began between Sarai and Cairo, with exchanges of assurances of friendship and agreements on joint action. Simultaneously, Tokhtamysh sent envoys west to the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vytautas, whose domains were rapidly expanding eastward and had already reached the lands of the Horde. Vytautas, an ambitious and far-sighted politician, was also interested in weakening both Moscow and the Horde, and an alliance with Tokhtamysh could be a useful tool in his complex game. The Khan even tried to establish contact with the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid, the Thunderbolt, another formidable opponent of Tamerlane. He also negotiated with the Genoese merchants in Crimea, trying to secure their financial and naval support. For a short time, Tokhtamysh became the center of a web of intrigue that spanned half the continent. He was still a figure of global stature, the legitimate Khan of a great power, and many were willing to bet on him in the struggle against the Iron Lame. However, this bustling activity had a downside. It finally convinced Tamerlane that Tokhtamysh was not just a troublesome neighbor, but an existential threat capable of uniting all his enemies against him. By building his coalition, Tokhtamysh only hastened his own demise, giving Tamerlane even more reason to strike, a blow that was meant to be the last. Tamerlane, receiving reports from his spies about Tokhtamysh's diplomatic activities, his alliance with Egypt, and his negotiations with Lithuania, came to a final, cold conclusion. He realized that a simple military victory, like the one at Kondurcha, would not solve the problem. Tokhtamysh's army could be defeated, but as experience had shown, he would just gather a new one. Tokhtamysh himself could be killed, but another Chinggisid would take his place and might continue his policies. The problem was not Tokhtamysh as a person, but the very source of his power. And the source of the Golden Horde's power was its unique economic system. The Horde was not just a nomadic empire, it was a gigantic trade intermediary, controlling the northern branch of the Great Silk Road. The wealth of the Horde, which allowed it to maintain huge armies, was based on tariffs from caravans, on the thriving urban culture and crafts in the cities of the lower Volga, such as Sarai Berke, Haji Tarkhan, and others. These cities were the nerve centers and the financial heart of the empire, and Tamerlane, as a brilliant strategist, made a decision that predetermined the entire subsequent history of Eastern Europe. He decided to strike not at the army, but at the economy. His goal was not just defeat, but the complete and irreversible destruction of the Golden Horde as a civilizational and commercial phenomenon. He planned not just to plunder the cities, but to wipe them from the face of the earth. He wanted to physically destroy the caravan routes that passed through the Horde's steppes and redirect them south, through his own empire, through Iran and Transoxiana. It was a decision for the economic murder of an entire country. He was marching north not to punish Tokhtamysh, but to rip out the very tree that nourished his strength by its roots. It was a plan for total war, a war of annihilation, and its cold, calculated cruelty was far more terrifying than any impulsive rage. As he prepared for his second campaign, Tamerlane already envisioned not a battlefield, but ruins upon which nothing would ever grow again. In the spring of 1395, Tamerlane began his second, apocalyptic campaign to the north. This time, he was even better prepared, leading elite troops hardened in dozens of campaigns. He did not march directly to the Volga, but chose a roundabout route. Through the Caucasus, along the western coast of the Caspian Sea, through the lands of his enemies. This allowed him to solve several problems at once: punish the mountain peoples who sympathized with Tokhtamysh, and get behind the main forces of the horde's Khan, cutting off his escape routes to the Caucasus. Tokhtamysh, having gathered all his forces, awaited the enemy. He knew this was the decisive battle, the last chance to defend his empire and his life. He met Tamerlane's army on the bank of the Terek River in the foothills of the Caucasus. Here, in April of 1395, the second and final great battle between the two titans took place. Tokhtamysh fought with the desperation of a doomed man. His warriors, knowing they were fighting for their homes and families, showed incredible bravery. At one point, the horde's forces even managed to break through the center of Tamerlane's army and rush towards his headquarters. It seemed that history might turn back, that a miracle was possible. But just as at Kondurcha, at the decisive moment, the iron discipline and tactical genius of the Iron Lame prevailed. He personally led a counterattack of his reserve regiments, clad in heavy armor. The impact of this iron avalanche was terrifying. The horde's ranks, already exhausted by the battle, faltered and fled. This time, the defeat was even more crushing than 4 years earlier. Tokhtamysh's army was not just defeated, it was almost completely annihilated, exterminated during the pursuit. The Khan himself managed to escape again, but this time he was no longer just a defeated commander, but a fugitive with death itself on his heels. The Battle of the Terek was the final chord in the history of the unified and powerful Golden Horde. After it, the empire no longer had the strength to protect its heart, and Tamerlane moved unimpeded into the depths of its lands to complete his terrible plan. The victory on the Terek opened the way for Tamerlane into the very heart of the Golden Horde. What followed was not the usual plunder of a defeated territory. It was the methodical, cold, and deliberate destruction of a civilization. The Iron Lame's army split into several corps and swept across the entire territory of the Ulus of Yochi, from the Caucasus to the Volga and the Don, like a fiery tornado. The main targets were the cities, the centers of trade, craft, and Islamic culture that formed the basis of the horde's power. The first to fall was the rich trading city of Azak, Azov, at the mouth of the Don. Then the same fate befell the Genoese colony of Tana, a crucial point in trade with Europe. After that, Tamerlane's divisions moved east, towards the lower Volga. One by one, all the key centers were taken, plundered, and burned to the ground. Haji Tarkhan, the future Astrakhan, Sarai al-Jadid, and finally, the capital, the magnificent Sarai Burq. This city, one of the largest in the medieval world, was not just burned, it was systematically razed to its foundations. Chroniclers write that Tamerlane ordered the land on which the city stood to be plowed over, so that nothing would ever grow there again. Mosques, madrasas, caravanserais, workshops, and libraries were destroyed. Artisans, scholars, and masters were driven into slavery in Central Asia by the thousands to strengthen Tamerlane's own empire. It was a true humanitarian and cultural catastrophe. Tamerlane did not just plunder. He uprooted the very possibility of revival. By destroying the cities and killing or enslaving the urban population, he shattered the trade infrastructure that had been built over centuries. The northern branch of the Great Silk Road, which passed through the Horde's steppes, ceased to exist. Merchants were forced to find new, alternative routes through Tamerlane's own domains. The economy of the Golden Horde received a mortal blow from which it could never recover. The nomadic aristocracy lost its source of income, and the central government was deprived of the financial base to maintain an army and an administrative apparatus. Tamerlane had achieved his goal. He had not just defeated his enemy, he had killed his empire. After the rout on the Tarik and the destruction of the Horde's cities, the darkest period of Tokhtamysh's life began. He once again became what he had been in his distant youth, an exile, a fugitive without land, without an army, and without hope. But if in his youth he had a powerful patron in Tamerlane, now the whole world was against him. He turned into a ghost, an eternal wanderer, pursued at every turn by his enemies. With a small detachment of surviving warriors, he fled north, to the lands of the Bulgar Ulis. But even there, Tamerlane's troops caught up with him. He fled again, this time to Siberia, trying to find support among the local clans. Then his tracks appear in the west, where he seeks refuge with his recent ally, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Vytautas. Vytautas took him in, but not out of mercy. The ambitious Lithuanian ruler saw the deposed Khan as a valuable political card to be played in his own struggle for influence in the east. For Tokhtamysh, this was the final humiliation. He, the great Khan and descendant of Genghis Khan, had become a pawn in the hands of an infidel Lithuanian prince. His life turned into an endless series of wanderings and intrigues. He lost everything: his family, who were captured by Tamerlane, his comrades, who were either killed or betrayed him, and his empire, which was crumbling to pieces before his very eyes. The circle of his life closed with tragic symmetry. He began his journey as a persecuted exile, yearning to reclaim his throne, and he ended it in exactly the same way, only now he had neither youth, nor strength, nor hope for revenge. He became a living embodiment of the ancient wisdom that the higher you fly, the harder you fall. The eternal exile he was forced to watch helplessly as new predators rose from the ruins of the empire he had both created and destroyed, already dividing his legacy. The consequences of the catastrophe that Tokhtamysh brought upon his country were not long in coming. The most obvious and immediate result of the Horde's crushing defeat was a sharp change in the balance of power in its relations with the Russian lands. The Principality of Moscow, which only 13 years earlier had trembled before the Khan and paid tribute after a terrifying devastation, now saw a unique window of opportunity. Grand Prince Vasily I, son of Dmitry Donskoy, was a cautious but decisive politician. He saw that the Horde was mortally wounded. The central government in Sarai had collapsed, replaced by a new period of strife among various contenders for the throne, chief among them the powerful Emir Edigu. In this situation, Moscow made its historic choice. The tribute payments, restored by Tokhtamysh in 1382, were stopped, this time for good. Attempts by the new rulers of the Horde, particularly Edigu, to resume them, though accompanied by campaigns, such as Edigu's march on Moscow in 1408, no longer had the same effect. Roses had tasted freedom and no longer wished to return to a subordinate position. Thus, Tokhtamysh's greatest triumph, the burning of Moscow and the restoration of the yoke, turned into its complete opposite. It was his actions, which led to the war with Tamerlane, that created the conditions under which Russes could take the decisive step toward full sovereignty. Herein lies one of the main historical ironies of his reign. In striving to strengthen the Horde's power over Russes, he ultimately became the catalyst for its liberation. The shadow of his past triumph fell upon him like a curse. He forced Moscow to its knees, but the price was the destruction of his own empire, which allowed Moscow not just to rise from its knees, but to stand tall, and in the future, go on the offensive itself. He won the battle for tribute, but lost the historical war for dominance in Eastern Europe. The end of the great Khan's life was as tragic and inglorious as his final years. The grand drama of his confrontation with Tamerlane, a drama of universal scale, concluded not on a magnificent battlefield, but in the remote Siberian steppe as a result of a mundane and brutal feud. Herein lay the ultimate irony of his fate. The man who challenged the most powerful ruler in the world was not killed by him. Tamerlane died in 1405, never having caught his sworn enemy. Tokhtamysh's fate was decided by another man, Emir Edigu, the new de facto ruler of the crumbling Golden Horde. Edigu, founder of the Nogai Horde, was a product of the era of chaos, just like Mamai, powerful, cunning, and without any right to the Khan's throne. He saw in Tokhtamysh, the eternal wanderer, not just a deposed ruler, but a living symbol of the legitimate power of the Chinggisids, whose very existence hindered his ability to rule through puppet Khans. As long as Tokhtamysh was alive, he remained a potential banner for all the discontented, a threat to Edigu's shaky authority. And Edigu hunted him for many years. The end came around the year 1406. After another defeat, Tokhtamysh fled with a handful of followers to the vicinity of modern-day Tyumen. There, Edigu's sons caught up with him. In a final, desperate skirmish, the last great Khan of the Golden Horde was killed. The great unifier, the terror of Moscow, the rival of Tamerlane, fell not at the hand of a fellow Titan, but by the swords of the servants of a new usurper, born from the very chaos that he himself had exacerbated with his fatal war. This inglorious end put a final stop to his incredible biography. He died as he had lived in his last years, as a fugitive, betrayed and defeated. And his death became a symbol of the final collapse of the idea to which he had dedicated his life, the idea of a unified and powerful Golden Horde. With him died the very possibility of its revival. Tokhtamysh's death was not just the end of one man's life. It was the symbolic end of an entire era. He died in the Siberian wilderness, and with him died the very idea of a unified Golden Horde. His demise was the final nail hammered into the coffin of what was once the greatest continental empire. His legacy turned out to be dual and tragic. For the Golden Horde, his reign, which began as an era of revival, ended in ultimate catastrophe. The war with Tamerlane inflicted a mortal wound on the state. The destruction of its cities undermined the economy. The death of hundreds of thousands of warriors depleted its military strength, and the fall of the central government's authority triggered an irreversible process of disintegration. On the ruins of the Ulis of Jochi, left behind by Tokhtamysh and Tamerlane, new state formations began to grow like mushrooms after the rain. The Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Crimean Khanate, the Siberian Khanate, the Nogai Horde. They were all heirs to the great empire, but none of them could any longer lay claim to its former greatness. Tokhtamysh, who strove for absolute unity, through his actions, led to its final fragmentation. For Russes, however, his legacy proved to be paradoxically beneficial. By destroying the military and economic power of its main adversary, he, unwittingly, cleared the path for the Principality of Moscow to achieve hegemony in Eastern Europe. The weakened and fragmented horde could no longer effectively resist the growing power of Moscow. Thus, the man who burned the Russian capital and forced it to pay tribute again, in historical perspective, turned out to be one of the unwitting architects of Russia's future sovereignty. In the memory of different peoples, he remained completely different. For the descendants of the horde, he is a tragic figure, the last great Khan who flew too high and was burned by the rays of his own pride. For the Russians, he is a symbol of the last, most terrible wave of the horde's terror, a treacherous conqueror. History treated his legacy with cruel irony. He wanted to enter history as a great restorer, but he entered it as the unwitting gravedigger of his own empire and the liberator of his main enemy. Now, at the finale of our narrative, we can give a definitive and comprehensive answer to the main question posed at the very beginning. How did the last great Khan become the destroyer of the Golden Horde? The solution to this paradox lies in the very nature of his greatness. Tokhtamysh became a destroyer not in spite of being great, but precisely because he was. His greatness and his ruin are two sides of the same coin. His indisputable right to the throne as a Chinggisid gave him legitimacy, but it also bred in him an immense pride and a belief in his own exceptionalism. His unbending will and persistence, forged during his years of exile, allowed him to unite the country. But they also turned into blind stubbornness that prevented him from backing down in the conflict with Tamerlane when it was necessary. His grandiose dream of reviving the empire to the borders of Batu's time gave him purpose and energy, but it also pushed him into reckless conquests and pitted him against the only man in the world who was stronger than him. Success blinded him. The victory over Mamai, the unification of the horde, the burning of Moscow, all this created an illusion of his own omnipotence. He began to believe that he, the legitimate Khan and descendant of Genghis Khan, was permitted everything. He forgot that his rise would have been impossible without Tamerlane's help, and instead of gratitude and caution, he showed arrogance and ingratitude. He became the destroyer of the horde because he tried to raise it to a height it could no longer sustain, and threw it into a war it could not win. He was like a doctor who, trying to cure a patient of a chronic disease, internal strife, prescribed a medicine, war with Tamerlane, that turned out to be a deadly poison. Thus, the paradox is resolved. He was not either a creator or a destroyer. He was both at the same time, and his creative force inevitably flowed into a destructive one. His greatness was the cause of his triumph, and his triumph bred the pride that became the cause of his fall and the ruin of his empire. The story of Tokhtamysh is more than just a chronicle of the rise and fall of a medieval ruler. It is an eternal, universal parable about the nature of power, ambition, and human destiny that resonates through the ages. It teaches us that within every light, a shadow is hidden, and in every strength, the seed of weakness. A person's greatest virtues, their will, their drive for order, their dream of greatness, can, when taken to an extreme, turn into their opposites: stubbornness, tyranny, and destructive pride. The story of Tokhtamysh is a clear lesson on how easily one can mistake confidence for arrogance and courage for recklessness. It is a warning to all leaders about the danger of forgetting those who helped you reach the top and the peril of believing in your own infallibility. His tragedy is the tragedy of a man who loved the idea of his empire so much that in trying to make it absolute, he destroyed it to its foundations. He wanted to become a sun that warms and unites his lands, but he turned into a scorching fire that left behind only a burned desert and ashes. And looking at his path from obscurity to the pinnacle of the world and back into obscurity, we inevitably ask a question that is still relevant today. Where is that thin line where creative ambition turns into a blind, all-consuming passion? And how many empires, both ancient and modern, have fallen and will yet fall not from external enemies, but from the internal demons of their own leaders who, like Tokhtamysh, forgot that even the greatest of mortals are still only human. His story leaves us with this eternal question, reminding us that the most dangerous enemy is often hidden not behind the fortress walls, but in the mirror.